welcome the author, Linda Brennan, and Cheryl Kirk Noll, the illustrator of the book that we read with Mr. and Mrs. Schmidt, The Black Regiment. Okay, thank you. You're welcome.
Just go back before we get started. Can I use that? Go back.
Okay, I'm the illustrator of the Black Regiment, and I had worked as an illustrator for my career, and I illustrated over 30 books and a lot of educational materials, and also taught at Rhode Island School of Design children's book illustration.
And I'm Linda Crotta Brennan. I'm the author of The Black Regiment of the American Revolution and over 20 other books for young readers, including most recently The Selkie's Daughter, an award-winning fantasy for young readers. So, okay. But today we're going to concentrate on the Black Regiment of the American Revolution. All right. I wish I could say that I came up with the idea for this book, but I didn't. Kate Munro and Bob Holtzman of Moon Mountain Publishing were talking to the then Governor Bruce Sunland, and he told them about the Black Regiment of the American Revolution. And they said, you know, this needs to be a book for young readers. They need to know this history. So they contacted me and asked me to write it. I knew nothing about the Black Regiment of the American Revolution. I'd never even heard of it. I grew up in New Jersey, not Rhode Island. I didn't know this piece of Rhode Island history. So where should I start to learn about it? Well, one of the things I found is that I looked online too, through the internet. I Googled it. I found almost nothing. So books were a much better resource for me. So I looked in all the books, and then I look at the back of the books to see where those books got their information. I kind of followed it back. And this is what I learned. I learned that there were lots of blacks who fought in the American Revolution, both for the British and for the Americans, over 10,000 of them. And I also learned that there was slavery in the North, not just in the South. There was slavery in all the colonies. And the second largest slaving port in America at that time was Newport, Rhode Island. The second largest was Charleston, South Carolina. Okay, so where do I go from here? And some of you already mentioned some other things. So now I have to do what we call primary research, right? I have to dig deeper. I don't just want to repeat what I found in everybody else's book. I want to dig a little deeper. So I went to the Rhode Island Historical Society, and there they have all sorts of wonderful archives, including things like this muster roll. And so I looked at all these muster rolls. They had information about who was in the regiment, where they were born, where they were living now, what their jobs were, how old they were, all sorts of wonderful, wonderful information. And they also had lists of equipment that the Black Regiment were given. And it was kind of chilling because there was like the lists of, we gave this one enlisted and we gave him this, this, and this, and then they had to sign their names. And many of the men in the Black Regiment couldn't read or write, so I got to see the X's they made, really, those men. And one of the things I learned is that those men were issued 2 of these shirts for a year. And these are called hunting shirts. And they were made out of muslin, which was a cheap and expensive material at that time. Can you imagine what this would have looked like after a year of only having 2 of these shirts to wear through all that fighting? Well, the Black Regiment had a nickname. They were also called the Naked Regiment. Okay. Then I went to the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and I talked to the director there. Her name was Bella Teixeira, and she told me some interesting things too. One of the things she told me is that the word black back then included a lot of different kinds of people. So the blacks in the Black Regiment were men from Africa who were born in Africa. There were men who had ancestors from Africa but were born here. There were also Native American men, because 100 years earlier there had been a war between the colonists and the Native Americans called the King Philip's War. The Native Americans lost that war and they were enslaved afterwards. And so these were descendants of those men who were enslaved from the King Philip's War. Okay, then somebody mentioned museums. I went to museums. And this is Smith's Castle. Obviously, it's not a castle at all, but it was a plantation during the Revolutionary War. And some of the slaves that worked on that plantation had enlisted in the regiment. So I got to find out what their lives were like before they enlisted. Then I went to search the battlefields. So this is Fort Barton in Tiverton, where the men mustered for one of the battles. And I went to other battlefield sites, many here in Portsmouth, and I went down into Newport to see where things were set up there. And I got the feel of how the battles were waged, where the different groups were, the different armies were set up, how one army had to run up a hill, that kind of thing. So I really got a sense of what they were like. Okay. Then I talked to reenactors and experts like the men at Varnum Armory. They were very helpful. And they told me all sorts of things. So reenactors really, they're volunteers who spend their weekends dressed up like Revolutionary War men and practicing and living like they did. So they really had a feel for what it was like to be a Revolutionary War soldier. And one of the things I learned from them was how difficult it was to fire a musket. To fire a single shot out of a musket, you had to go through 12 steps. So you would take the gunpowder from your powder horn and you would pour it down the muzzle of your gun. Then you would take your bullet that had been wrapped in paper earlier and ram it down the barrel of your gun, and so on and so forth and so forth. And so what they would do is they would fight in a block, and the men in the front row would fire, then they'd kneel down, the men behind them would fire, and they would kind of trade back and forth so they could keep up the firing going. I also found out that the muskets were very inaccurate. So you might aim over there, but the bullet would ricochet up and down the barrel and sometimes could shoot out the other way. So, you would fight in blocks because then you would at least have an opportunity to hit something, And the other thing is that some of the men would actually not bother to aim. They would turn away, because when the gunpowder exploded, it could sometimes burn your cheek. So they would just fire like that. I talked to individuals, and this is Nancy Goncalves, and she's a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And her ancestor, Philip Rodman, was one of the members of the Black Regiment. And she told me stories that had been passed down through her family. And one was that he only received 3 months of pension after the war was over. And that was partially because our nation was broke. So, okay, now I've got all this wonderful information. I have to now sit down and write the book, right? And I could have kept on researching. I loved learning all this stuff. But I had a 6-month deadline, so I had to research and write within that 6 months. I also had space limits. This book is only 32 pages long. It's geared for young readers. And so I couldn't include some stuff. I wanted to include some stuff about, the first victim of the British there, Crispus Attucks, who was an African American. And I couldn't put that in the book. It didn't fit. So I had to decide what was important, what I really needed to tell people to get the story across. I also had to consider my audience because I didn't want to bore young readers with lots of unfamiliar names and dates. So I sat down and I wrote. Now there's an old saying, there is no such thing as a published writer. There are only published rewriters. So I wrote my first draft. I sent it to these people who are in my writing group, and they're all other authors, and they looked at it and they made suggestions on how to make it better. So I went back and rewrote, gave it to them again. They had more suggestions, back and forth, back and forth. Then finally I thought I was done. I sent it to the editor at Moon Mountain, and they had suggestions too. So I had to rewrite again. Now, I never kept track for this book of how many times I rewrote the book. So when I was done, it looked like this. All right, a typed page, or a file on a computer nowadays. All right, so what's missing to make it a book? Pictures, yes. So here we go, Cheryl.
This is where I came in. So the publisher hired me to illustrate the manuscript that Linda had already written. Linda and I knew each other, but not well. So one of the best things about this job was that we have a long-standing friendship. First, I had to do research, just like Linda, and I went to many of the sources that she did, the Historical Society, and I talked to the woman from the DAR. But I was focusing on visual research because I wanted to see, there were no cameras back then, so what did people look like? You had to go by descriptions, and there was a little bit of art available. For example, this particular piece was drawn by a French soldier, Jean-Baptiste Antoine de Vergère, in 1781. I was especially lucky that right when I got the assignment, there was a reenactment planned happening right here in Portsmouth, the Battle of Rhode Island, which is in the book. And there were 1,000 people who came dressed up in carefully researched period clothing and reenacted the very battle that I was supposed to illustrate. So that was really great. And Linda and I both went to the reenactment. We talked to participants, and I took several hundred photos. I didn't have digital cameras at the time, so it was on film. And you were able to just experience what it was like to be in the heat of the battle, to hear the boom of the guns and the drum rolls, and to smell the smoke and feel the heat of August. And we also got to meet reenactors who were portraying the Black Regiment. And this is a camp that was set up to look like the kinds of camps that the soldiers would have slept in back then and eaten and all of that kind of stuff. It helped me to think of these men as individuals. to see people portraying them. You know, people who had families that they'd left behind, and old men and young men. And it made me think that each one of them was an individual, so I tried to include that in my illustrations. Now it's time for me to get down to planning my art. And the publisher had hired Linda, and they hired me. They also hired a designer, someone who would figure out how everything fit together in this 32-page book. And they had to find illustrations, the text, and maps, and some other photos and things like that. All had to fit together. So this gray area on the right-hand side is going to be my art. And here are several more pages, double-page spreads, of what I was given, showing where I had to put art and what size it would have to be. I had some input on the design, but not too much. I had to start with the cover first because they need a cover before everything else, so when they're ready to publish the book, they can advertise it. So I did 3 layouts here, and they liked the third one the best. You see, they all have the same elements of the soldiers with guns and flags. They sent my sketches, after I did a finished sketch, to people who were experts and who knew what these soldiers wore, which were mostly the reenactors. And they had a lot to say. I had the hats wrong. The soldiers wore bicorns, which were hats with two sides, whereas civilians wore tricorns, which had 3 sides to them. And I still have trouble figuring out the difference between the 2 of them. They were hard for me. There also, I wasn't allowed to have an American flag because they've done research and they did not have the American flag at the Battle of Rhode Island. So I had to take that out. And some, like the strap for what they wore, the ammunition box they wore, which was all lead bullets, and they were heavy. So the strap had to be thicker because it wouldn't have held up that weight. So lots of little details like that I had to make changes. So this is the finished art, and I did sneak in some red and white stripes in the clouds. They kind of give you the feeling of that flag. This is how I start. I work first from a sketch in pencil on tracing paper, and then I send it to, I was trying to get the feeling of this is in Valley Forge, and that was the winter that they just spent sitting around, and it was freezing cold, and nobody had enough food or enough clothing to wear. So I tried to get that kind of idea across in this illustration. Then I did some hints of color, which I did on the computer, and we sent it to the experts again. And again, they had comments. So plenty of comments. This one, the page had mentioned 3 officers, and I had only drawn 2. And also, they didn't think that my cabin was quite right. And somebody had taken photos down at Valley Forge of these carefully reconstructed cabins. There's, a park there now. And so I was able to depict them more accurately. So here it is with the changes. I have the cabin is more rectangular than square, and I have 3 officers in the thing. Then I paint it, and it's almost done here. It's missing one thing. I added snow. So after the Rhode Island Assembly passed the bill to enlist slaves, Colonel Greene led them in endless drills. Again, I was informed by reenactors. A lot of the militia groups were made up of ragtag farmers, and the Continental Army was often undersupplied. So you can see people have their clothing is torn and stuff like that. I wanted to create this page to look like inexperienced men who were later going to grow into the experienced troops that fought at the Battle of Yorktown. Next, I illustrated the French Admiral Comte d'Estaing with the American General Sullivan when the French fleet met in Newport. Prominent individuals were often well documented in paintings of the day, so I searched through the visual record. When I found this illustration, I was delighted. I liked his hat. I thought that would be really fun to illustrate. But I found out that this drawing, this engraving, was done during the Civil War, almost 100 years after the Revolution. And the artist who drew it wanted it to look appealing to people of his time, so he gave him a stylish hat of the time, and he also had the facial hair that they would have worn during the Civil War. They were always clean shaven during the Revolution, and they wore wigs. That was the style for men to wear wigs. So at any rate, this was inaccurate. They would not have looked like that. So here I have d'Estaing with his white wig, nice and proper, and the very much more relaxed American who just has his hair in a ponytail. But he's clean shaven. I'd like to share my process. This is step by step how I do an illustration. So I begin with an initial sketch. Usually it takes me quite a bit of revision to get to this point. And then I sent it off for revisions and so forth. The next thing I do is that I transfer the sketch to watercolor paper. And to do that, I put the sketch on a light table and watercolor paper on top of it, and I just trace it up with pencil. This is the pencil sketch. I then, you know how when you work with watercolors, sometimes the paper buckles, gets real ripply. So what I do is I soak the paper in, it's special watercolor paper. I soak it in a tub of water for 5 minutes, and then I blot it and staple it to a stiff piece of cardboard. And as it dries, it pulls taut like a drum head, and then it won't ripple when I paint it. I can work it as much as I want to. I start with an underpainting. I use a violet color to establish lights and darks. So I'm trying to have this nighttime scene. I'm starting it off by thinking that the moonlight is where the light is coming from. So you can see it's darker on the left and lighter as it moves towards the moon. The next thing I'm going to do is to glaze colors on top of that, like a transparent color. So if you look at the soldier who's standing, look at his face, and then you can see here, when I glaze the colors, how I've just glazed some brown over that face, but it still has the light and dark areas showing. Then I use something called Resist. Resist is a sticky, yucky thing to work with. It's kind of like rubber cement, and when you put it down, it protects the paper. So wherever you put it is going to stay what it is. And then I started to paint the sky, and I used a ultramarine blue and a 1-inch brush, and I go from left to right, making a line, And then I keep doing that, covering up everything I've already painted, which, to tell you the truth, is a very scary part of the process. And you can kind of see in the moon there how that the watercolor has bubbled up over the resist, but it's not going to show after it dries. So then you can see after that, after it's entirely dry, okay, this is a close-up, and you can see a little bit more, like the stars are still white, and then there's that bubbled up color on top of the resist on the moon, and some of the shirts. But let me see. This is basically what, sorry, I apologize for this slide. It's really bad. But it gives you an idea of what it looks like. After the resist is entirely dried, I just rub it off using my hands. And this is what it looks like. Then I want to go back in and add details. So you can, if you look at especially the reflection of the moon in the water, you'll see in the finished painting how it's not that white and blue anymore, how I've added a lot of information to it. I also use models, and this is my husband and my son and his friend. My husband's getting stabbed by a golf club, I think, and my son is on the floor. And this is what the finished illustration looked like.
Oh, yeah, so it's like,
So, at any rate, and this was a skirmish that happened down in New Jersey, actually, and all the reports say that it was a surprise attack. So the British are in uniform, and the Black Regiment is dressed in their night clothes for this. So here is once we've had everything combined, the art. And there's like a little section of my art that the designer added into the strip on the left with palettes and stuff like that. And they pull it into a cohesive whole.
All right. Oops.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right. So we know that you have read the book, but for the sake of the viewers who have not read the book, we're going to go through quickly what the story is about. So, after the bitter winter at Valley Forge, Rhode Island couldn't get enough soldiers to enlist in the regiment. And they were supposed to send 2 regiments to the Continental Army. If they didn't, the colony would be fined. So we didn't want to have to pay a fine. We needed to get up some soldiers, find some soldiers. And so the officers of the Rhode Island officers came up with the idea of enlisting slaves. After all, Rhode Island was the colony with the most slaves of any state in the North. And so after some convincing, the Rhode Island legislature enacted a bill that would grant freedom to any slave who enlisted in the regiment. And their owners would be compensated by the state, and the soldiers would be paid the same bounty and wages as white soldiers, which was unique. That was a unique part in that bill. Well, as you can imagine, let's see, there we go. As you can imagine, the slaves were very eager to enlist, so very quickly we filled the regiment. But that regiment only had, let's see where I am. They only had about 3 weeks, 3 months to, let me find my space here, sorry. Okay, slaves eagerly volunteered. They responded to the call and became the backbone of the Rhode Island 1st Regiment, known as the Black Regiment. The regiment only had 3 months to train before they were thrown into a major battle, the fight to drive the British from Newport, called the Battle of Rhode Island. Now, the French had promised to help us, and French Count d'Estaing and American General John Sullivan got together to plan an attack. But things didn't go as planned. First of all, there was some disagreement between the two of them, and also the French ships were destroyed in a hurricane. So now the French limped away, leaving us alone to face the British. And the British had many more troops than us, and we could not fight them by ourselves at that point, and so we were forced to retreat. Now, the trouble with that is that we had come to Aquidneck Island, so now we're on an island, all our troops, and we were in danger of being captured by the British. And so the British sent their troops up West Main Road and up East Main Road. They were going to encircle and capture us, and they sent their allies, the Hessians, up East Main Road, West Main Road, to capture us. And so we had to stop them. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get off the island. So they set up ambushes along East Main Road, and that stopped the British. But the Hessians kept coming. Now, the Hessians were the most fearsome soldiers in the Revolutionary War. They were Germans, they were professional soldiers, they fought all their lives. And so the Hessians thought for sure they could easily punch through our lines and encircle and capture us, because according to one of the men's diaries, one of the Hessians' diaries, they faced wild-looking black men in their shirt sleeves. They would do this no sweat. So the Hessians attacked once. The Black Regiment drove them back. The Hessians attacked a second time. The Black Regiment drove them back. The Hessians attacked a third time, and the Black Regiment, with a little help from some other folks, drove them back and saved our entire army from capture. Now, the Black Regiment went on to fight for the rest of the Revolutionary War, eventually taking part in the battle at Yorktown, where they overcame a British redoubt and were part of our victory there, a victory which forced the British to surrender. Okay, so finally the war is over. What happened to the Black Regiment after that? What happened is that we did keep our promise, and all those slaves were freed at the end of the war. Sometimes after a fight from their commander, who fought for them to make sure they were allowed to be free. But it was not just them that they were worried about. Their wives and their children weren't free. So many of the veterans of the Black Regiment worked for long, hard years to buy their families' freedom. But things were changing because whites had fought alongside blacks during the Revolutionary War. And one of the men who fought with the Black Regiment, who was a white soldier, went around giving speeches like this: liberty, independence, freedom were in every man's mouth. They were the sounds at which they rallied and under which they fought and bled. The word slavery then filled their hearts with horror. They fought because they would not be slaves. And one by one, after the Revolutionary War, the northern states passed laws ending slavery. And here in Rhode Island, we ruled that any child born to a slave after March 1st, 1784, was free. And so our book is dedicated to the brave men of the Black Regiment, brave soldiers who proved that all people deserve to be free. Thank you very much.